My mother's funeral drew 7 people on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and the cold that settled over the cemetery that day felt less like weather and more like a judgment. The sky was the color of old pewter. The grass had gone yellow at the edges. A wind moved through the bare oak trees at the perimeter of the lot, and the sound it made was the sound of paper being shuffled in an empty room. I stood at the edge of the grave and counted the faces. Leander, my older brother, stood to my left, his jaw set in the way it always was when he was working hard not to feel something. 3 colleagues from Jefferson High School stood in a loose cluster near the back, women in their 60s, who had taught beside my mother for decades and who seemed genuinely sad in the practiced, professional way that people become sad at the funerals of coworkers. The funeral director stood at a respectful distance with his hands folded in front of him. And at the very back of the small gathering, half hidden behind a stone column, was a woman I had never seen before in my life. She was in her early 60s, heavy set, wearing a dark green coat that was too light for the temperature. She was watching the coffin with an expression I could not read from where I stood. I looked at my brother. He was staring straight ahead at the lowering mechanism above the grave. He had not noticed the woman. The priest said the words that priests say. The mechanism hummed. My mother, Josephine Langford, retired English teacher woman of strict routines and locked doors, descended into the earth. Before the pallbearers covered the casket with the lid, I stepped forward and adjusted the position of my mother's hands, which had shifted slightly during transport. Her right hand lay palm down across her left wrist, and as I straightened it, I saw the scar. I had seen it 10,000 times. A long, pale ridge running from her knuckle to the base of her thumb, on the right hand, smooth with age, the kind of scar that comes from something sharp and serious and old. I had seen it every day of my childhood, and I had never once asked about it. She had never once mentioned it. In 30 years of living in the same house, breathing the same air, eating at the same table, we had both agreed, without speaking, to let that scar go unexplained. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have. Leander appeared at my elbow. "They need to close it," he said quietly. I stepped back. The scar went into the ground with everything else. Reginald Colborne's office occupied the 4th floor of a building on Tremont Street in downtown Boston, and the elevator that carried Leander and me up to it moved with the slow gravity of an institution that had been charging high fees for a very long time. The waiting room had mahogany paneling and paintings of boats and storms. The receptionist spoke in a voice just above a whisper. The whole place smelled of old paper and beeswax. Reginald Colborne himself was a man of perhaps 70, thin in the way that some men become thin when they pass 60, the flesh redistributing itself away from the face and hands. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and a charcoal suit, and he shook both our hands with a grip that was professionally firm. He gestured us into chairs across from his desk and opened a manila folder with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this many hundreds of times. He reviewed the expected items without drama, the life insurance policy which covered the funeral expenses with a modest remainder. The row house in Brooklyn paid off entirely to be divided equally between Leander and me. He paused between sections to let the information settle, and during one of those pauses, I watched him glance at his watch. Just a flick of the eyes, quick enough that Leander, who was staring at the surface of the desk, did not catch it. But I caught it, and something about the motion bothered me in a way I could not immediately explain. "However," Reginald said, opening a second folder and sliding a heavy yellowed envelope across the desk, "there is an addendum, a property your mother acquired 25 years ago. It was kept outside the primary trust at her explicit request." Leander stopped staring at the desk. "What kind of property?" "A cottage, located north of Moosehead Lake in Maine, a township called Oak Haven." Reginald folded his hands with careful neutrality. "I must confess I only learned of its existence when she updated her files 5 years ago. She was quite specific about the transfer terms. The property goes solely to you, Scylla, upon her passing." The silence that followed was not a comfortable one. "Just to Scylla," Leander said. His voice had gone flat in the way it did when he was suppressing something larger. "Why, she left a note." Reginald gestured to a folded piece of paper resting on top of a set of heavy rusted iron keys. I picked up the note. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, sharp and precise, and leaning slightly to the right, the cursive of a woman who had spent 40 years writing corrections in the margins of student essays. "Scylla," it read, You were always the one asking questions I could not answer. Go to Oak Haven. Do not take anyone but Leander. Do not tell anyone else where you are going. Open the house. You will understand why I had to be the way I was. I read it twice. Then I turned it over. On the back in pencil so faint, it was nearly invisible against the paper were 9 words RC knows. Trust no one he sends. I looked up at Reginald Colborne, who was watching me with an expression of practiced sympathy. I looked at his watch on his wrist, and I thought about the way his eyes had gone to it twice during a 15-minute meeting. I folded the note and put it in my coat pocket without showing Leander the back. Thank you, I said to Reginald, and my voice came out steady, which surprised me. Leander was less steady. On the elevator down, he turned to me with his arms crossed and his voice controlled, but barely. A secret property in Maine that she acquired 25 years ago and never mentioned once. Left only to you. With a note that reads like the setup to a horror movie. Does any part of this seem normal to you? No, I said honestly, none of it does. I want to know who verified that deed. I want to know how a high school English teacher on a public school salary bought property in rural Maine in the 1990s. I want to know why Colborne only found out about it 5 years ago if he was her attorney of record. He was ticking the points off on his fingers, and I recognized the gesture. It was what Leander did when he was frightened and trying to convert the fear into something manageable. He had been a structural engineer for 20 years. He dealt with fear by turning it into a problem that could be assessed and solved. Leander, I said as the elevator reached the lobby. What? Not here. He looked at me for a moment, then at the lobby around us, and something in my expression made him stop. He nodded once and we walked out of the building into the cold Boston air. The woman in the green coat was standing on the sidewalk. She had positioned herself slightly apart from the flow of foot traffic between a newspaper box and a fire hydrant, and she was watching the building entrance. When she saw us come out, she moved forward with the deliberateness of someone who had been rehearsing this moment. Priscilla Langford, she said, not a question. Yes, my name is Vivian Calloway. I was your mother's neighbor in Brooklyn for 11 years. I am sorry for your loss. She glanced at Leander, then back to me. I need to tell you something before you go up to that property. Leander stepped forward slightly. How do you know about the property? I do not, Vivian said. I know that a man came to your mother's door 3 weeks before she died. I was in my garden. I saw him from across the fence. He was perhaps 35, lean dark hair, a particular stillness about him that I did not like. He knocked and she opened the door, and the moment she saw his face, she tried to close it again. He put his hand out and stopped it. They spoke for a moment through the gap. Then she closed the door and he left. And for the next 2 days, she did not come outside. She did not collect her mail. The lights in her bedroom were on all night, both nights. The three of us stood on the sidewalk while people moved around us. Leander pulled me a few feet away and kept his voice low. This could be staged. Someone who knows we are going up there and wants to plant doubt. Colborne could have arranged this. She was at the funeral, I said. Colborne was not. She came on her own. That does not prove anything. It means she cared enough to stand in the cold and wait to tell us this in person. The information she just gave us does not help Colborne. It makes us suspicious of him. Or it is designed to make us think exactly that. Then we will be careful. I held his look, but we listened. Leander was quiet for a moment, and then he uncrossed his arms, which was as much concession as he was going to offer. I went back to Vivienne. She was looking past my shoulder at the upper floor windows of the building we had just left. Not the 4th floor where Reginald's office was, but the 3rd. His office is on the 4th floor, I said. I know, she said. That is not where I am looking. She held my gaze and let the implications settle without elaborating. Then she took a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket and put it in my hand. This is my number. If you see anything unusual up there, call me before you call the police. Please. She paused. I am serious about the before part. She walked away without explaining further. I looked at the 3rd floor windows. They were empty now, nothing behind the glass but the reflection of gray sky. But empty now meant very little about what had been there 90 seconds ago. Leander and I left Boston the following morning in his old station wagon with a printed map that Reginald Colborne had provided the driving route marked in yellow highlighter with a precision that looked less like it had been printed in a hurry and more like it had been prepared in advance, studied and prepared again. The roads were clear through Massachusetts, and the transition from suburban density to the pine corridors of coastal New Hampshire happened gradually. By the time we crossed into Maine and turned inland, the trees had closed in on both sides of the highway, and the October light had taken on that quality it has in the North Gold and slightly thin, as though the season were measuring what it had left. Leander drove. I sat with the map on my lap and my mother's note folded in my coat pocket, and I thought about things I had not let myself think about in years. I thought about a night when I was 9 years old when I got up at 2 in the morning for water and found my mother sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. She was not doing anything. She was not reading or writing or eating. She was sitting very still with her hands flat on the table, staring at the backyard window with an expression that was not sadness and not grief, but something closer to sustained vigilance. The face of a person listening for a sound that had not arrived yet, but that they knew with certainty eventually would. I went back upstairs without my water, and I never mentioned what I had seen. I thought about the camping trip in 7th grade, the overnight to a state forest in New Hampshire that every student in my grade was going on, and how my mother had refused without anger, without negotiation, simply and completely the way she refused things when there was nothing left to discuss. That forest is not safe, she had said. Not the woods, not nature in general. That specific forest spoken with the knowledge of a person who had a reason. I thought about the first time I brought a boyfriend home at 22 and how my mother had shaken his hand and asked in a tone that was perfectly pleasant on the surface and completely interrogative underneath where his family was from and where they were living now. Leander's voice pulled me out of it. Did she ever seem happy to you? The question caught me sideways. What? Not pleased because the house was clean or satisfied because you did well on something. Actually happy, like she was glad to be alive and knew it. I looked at the trees going past, spruce and fir, the green deepening as we moved further north. I do not know, I said honestly. I cannot find a single memory of it. He kept his eyes on the road. I can find moments when she was not unhappy. That is not the same thing. He was right. I did not know what to do with the fact that he was right, so I said nothing, and we drove in silence for a long stretch through the deepening afternoon. We lost cell service south of Greenville, and from there we navigated entirely by Reginald's printed map, counting turnoffs that had no signs. The GPS rotated helplessly. The last town of any size before Oak Haven was a place called Harmon Falls, population 700, according to the peeling sign at its edge. We stopped at a gas station that smelled of motor oil and old coffee, and while Leander filled the tank, I went inside. The woman behind the counter was in her 70s, white-haired, unhurried. I bought 2 cups of coffee from a machine, and then, on an impulse I did not entirely understand, I asked her if she knew Oak Haven. She looked at me for a moment before answering. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the measuring quality of someone who has lived in one place long enough to know which questions are ordinary and which are not. Old summer community, she said. Most of those properties have been dark for years. Nobody goes up there in October. She handed me my change. You have family up there. Something like that, I said. She nodded slowly, looking past me at Leander pumping gas outside. Road past the junction gets bad in the dark, she said. Watch the second left after the creek crossing. Sign's been down since spring. I thanked her and went back to the car. I told Leander what she said. He noted the detail about the sign without comment, but I saw him check the map again and trace the route with his finger before he pulled back onto the road. We found the missing sign location because of her warning. Without it, we would have driven past the turnoff and spent an hour finding our way back in the dark. I thought about that as we made the turn. I thought about the precision with which Reginald's map had been prepared, the yellow highlighter over every road, and I thought about the fact that the map did not note the missing sign. He had driven this route himself, or someone had done it for him. He knew about the creek crossing and the second left. He had simply chosen not to mention it. The final road was an unpaved logging track that jarred the car over exposed roots and frost heaves for nearly an hour before Leander slowed down. Halfway along the logging road, he stopped the car entirely. He turned the engine off. In the sudden silence, the forest around us was enormous. The darkness between the trees complete the only light, the pale glow of the dashboard, and the stars above the narrow cut of sky visible through the canopy. If we find something up there, he said, not looking at me, something that changes what we know about her, I need to know you are not going to let it change everything you remember. I understood what he was asking. He was not asking me to dismiss evidence or pretend. He was asking me to hold two things at once, the way you have to when someone you love turns out to have been a different person than you thought, and the loving and the not knowing were both real at the same time. She made us oatmeal every morning, I said. She corrected our grammar at the dinner table. She showed up to every single thing we were ever in, every school play, and every graduation and every uncomfortable parent conference. Those things were true regardless of anything else. Leander sat with that for a moment. Then he started the car. Okay, he said, and we drove the rest of the way in silence. There, he said, slowing again. Through the trees, barely visible in the early evening shadows, was a roofline. We parked at the edge of a collapsed wire fence and walked the rest of the way on foot. The driveway had been entirely reclaimed, waist-high weeds and young birch saplings growing through what had once been gravel. The trees around the property were massive old hemlocks, their canopies so dense that the failing light barely reached the ground, and the silence under them was not peaceful, but sealed. The cottage materialized slowly as we came up the drive. 2 stories of dark timber and fieldstone, compact and deliberately built, the kind of structure designed with durability as its only aesthetic principle. I stopped walking when I could see it fully. Every window on the ground floor was covered with marine-grade plywood bolted deep into the frames, sealed with the thoroughness that requires planning and tools and deliberate intention. The front door was steel set into a reinforced frame flanked by 2 deadbolts and a heavy iron padlock. This is not a vacation home, Leander said quietly. No, I agreed. He looked at me. Why does a high school English teacher need a place like this? I took the rusted keys from my coat pocket and walked to the front door. Leander went around the perimeter of the house, and after a minute, I heard him call from the east side. When I came around the corner, he was crouching at the base of the stone foundation, shining his flashlight into a narrow crack in the mortar. Look at this, he said. Wedged into the crack deliberately placed was a small piece of red cloth. Not fallen there by accident, not left by weather, but set precisely in the narrow gap, the way a person sets something they intend to find again. Leander looked up at me. In the low light, his face was unreadable. Neither of us said anything about it. We went back to the front door. It took 40 minutes to open the house. The padlock yielded to the largest key with a grinding squeal that sent a family of crows erupting from the canopy above. The deadbolts were stiff with years of disuse and required Leander to lean his full weight into the frame while I worked the keys with both hands. When the door finally moved, it had swung inward with a heavy final sound. The air that came out was cold and dense and stale, the smell of a sealed space that had been without light or circulation for a very long time. Paper and dry rot and something faintly chemical underneath. Leander clicked his heavy-duty flashlight to its highest setting, and I raised mine, and we stood on the threshold for a moment before stepping inside. What should have been a living room was not. There were no chairs, no rugs, no trace of domestic habitation. Instead, the walls were lined from floor to near ceiling with gray industrial metal filing cabinets, dozens of them, standing in tight formation. In the center of the room sat a single heavy wooden table, scarred and stained with decades of use, and on the table's surface rested a vintage shortwave radio. The amber dial on its face was dark. Even dead and silent, it dominated the room. I walked slowly toward the table. The floorboards announced at every step. Scylla! Leander's voice came from the far corner. Come here. He was standing in front of a massive corkboard covering most of the wall behind the filing cabinets. When I brought my light to bear on it, I understood immediately that whatever my mother had been doing in this house, it was not casual and it was not brief. The board was covered with newspaper clippings, yellow and brittle at the edges, arranged not randomly but in deliberate sequence. Between the clippings were hand-drawn maps with red pushpins, and between the pins ran lengths of string connecting them to photographs. The photographs were black and white, grainy in the way of surveillance work, faces often partially turned or partially obscured. I leaned in and read the clippings. They moved chronologically. A Boston Port Authority report from 1987, a missing freight manifest sealed by federal order, a 1988 indictment of a bank executive with alleged organized crime ties, a Providence warehouse fire in 1989, 3 deaths, arson suspected, a 1991 notice about a federal witness disappearing before a Senate subcommittee hearing. She was not collecting these, I said. She was tracking them. Leander was at one of the filing cabinets. He pulled a drawer open, and the metal complained loudly in the silence. He came out with a handful of sealed envelopes, each numbered and dated in pencil, the stack going back to 1992. He chose one from the middle and worked it open carefully. He read the single line inside aloud. They do not know where we are. We are safe for now. No signature, no context. He set it down and found the last envelope in the stack. The year written on it was 2019. He pulled it open and stopped. He held it out to me without speaking. Inside was a Polaroid photograph. I was in it, walking on the sidewalk outside the Brooklyn apartment building where I had lived from age 22 until 29. I was wearing a jacket I remembered well. I was carrying coffee from the corner place. I had no idea anyone had been watching me. Behind the photograph, in my mother's precise handwriting, were two sentences. She looks like Darlene. He will find her eventually. I read the words again. I looked at the date on the envelope, 2019. My mother had been watching me, or having me watched, or monitoring evidence that someone else was watching me, and she had never said a word. Leander was watching my face. He had already understood what the photograph meant, and something in him had shifted into a register I had only seen once before when he was 25 and I was 22, and a man had followed me home from the subway, and Leander had looked at that man with an expression that was a calculation rather than a threat. He took the envelope from me and put it in his own coat pocket. "We look at the rest of the house," he said. "All of it. Then we decide." We moved through the hallway into the kitchen bare except for a few rusted cans in the pantry. Near the east window at the base of the wall, the layer of dust was thinner than elsewhere. Not a footprint shape, but a pattern consistent with someone standing close to the window for an extended period, their presence disturbing the accumulated years of settle. Leander crouched and studied it. He looked up at the window and then back at the floor without saying anything. I knew what he was thinking because I was thinking it too. We headed upstairs. The second floor had two rooms. The first was completely empty. The second at the back of the house contained an iron cot, a small wooden nightstand, and a wardrobe against the far wall. There was no bedding, nothing in the nightstand, but the floor told a different story. The thick layer of dust had been disrupted repeatedly over a long period of time. There were two distinct sets of scrape marks in the oak floorboards. One set ran from the wardrobe toward the near wall and back as though the wardrobe had been moved and replaced many times over the years. The other set ran from the area near the cot toward the center of the room. And there was something else. On the far wall behind the wardrobe's shadow line, I could see the corkboard. Leander brought his light over. Pinned to it was a single photograph taken with the same grainy surveillance quality as the photos downstairs. A man in his mid-40s, dark suit, sharp features, confident posture. Around his face, drawn in red permanent marker, was a circle. Beneath it, in my mother's precise cursive, were three words. "He knows now." But the photograph was not hanging as it should have been. The push pin was still in the wall. The string attached to the pin was still there, but the photograph itself had been turned face to the wall, deliberately reversed so that the image faced the corkboard surface rather than the room. Leander looked at it and then at me. "Someone was in here after she died. Someone who knew that man," I said. "Someone who could not stand to look at his face." We stood with that for a moment. Then Leander turned his light back to the floor and followed the scrape marks toward the cot. He got down on his hands and knees and ran his fingers along the plank seams. "These are not nailed," he said. He pulled a flathead screwdriver from his back pocket and worked the tip into the gap between two boards. He pried upward, and a section came loose with a sharp crack. He lifted three short planks and set them aside. Beneath was a hollow cavity between the floor joists. Sitting in the hollow handle up was an olive green metal box. Leander gripped the handle and lifted it out. It was heavy enough that he adjusted his stance. He set it on the iron cot. We both looked at it. There was no padlock, just a heavy metal latch. I said, "Open it." Leander snapped the latch and lifted the lid. The first thing that registered was the money. Thick bundles of $100 bills in currency straps, the straps printed with the name of a bank that no longer existed. At least a dozen bundles packed tightly. Beneath them, a leather satchel. And sitting at the very edge of the box, tucked against the interior wall, a small velvet jewelry box. Leander lifted the satchel. I took the velvet box. I opened it first. Inside, folded tightly, was a birth certificate issued by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I unfolded it under my flashlight. Child's name, Thomas Percival Merritt. Date of birth, October 14th, 1988. 3 years before Leander was born. Mother Darlene Ann Merritt. Father Orville Merritt. Darlene Ann Merritt. I found the same name a moment later when I opened the satchel and spread its contents on the bare mattress. A Connecticut identification card from 1987. My mother's face, the name Darlene Ann Merritt, the birth date matching. Two passports alongside it, one American, one Canadian, both bearing my mother's face under different names and different hair. And behind the birth certificate, in the velvet box, tucked flat against the interior, a Polaroid photograph. My mother was young in it, younger than I had ever known her. She was holding a small child, a boy of perhaps 2, and she was smiling. Not the closed, controlled expression I had known every day of my childhood, but a real smile, unguarded, lit from somewhere inside, the smile of a person who was not watching the door. Standing beside her with his arm around her waist was a man I recognized. He was the same man whose photograph hung on the corkboard behind the wardrobe, the one my mother had circled in red, the one labeled with 3 words. He knows now. I looked at Leander. He was reading the birth certificate again slowly, as though a second reading might change what it said. The mother on that certificate was Darlene Merritt, but my mother's name was Josephine Langford. Had always been Josephine Langford from the first moment I could remember. Josephine Langford, who came from Connecticut, who lost everything in a fire before we were born, who never talked about her past because there was nothing left to talk about. Except there was. There was a child born to Darlene Merritt in 1988. There were passports and a false identity card and decades of sealed cash in a boarded-up house in the Maine woods built to keep something either in or out. Leander set the birth certificate down. He went to the corner of the room and stood with his back to me, one hand against the wall. His breathing was audible. I watched his back for a moment and did not speak, because what he was doing in that corner required time and silence and had no use for words. He was setting down something he had carried for 33 years without knowing it was a burden, and I left him to it. I looked at the man in the Polaroid photograph. I looked at the child my mother was holding. Then from directly below us came a sound that stopped everything. The steel front doors slammed shut with a force that reverberated up through the floor joists, and in the silence that followed came the clean metallic sound of a deadbolt sliding into place. From the outside, Leander moved before I did. He crossed the room in 3 steps and hit the staircase at a run, his boots loud on the bare boards, and I was right behind him. By the time I reached the ground floor, he had both hands flat against the steel door and was throwing his weight into it. The door did not move. It did not rattle. It did not give any indication that the force of a man's body against it meant anything at all. He stepped back and hit it again with his shoulder. Same result. Help! He drove his fist against the steel. Open the door. Leander, stop. I grabbed his arm. Whoever just locked us in is not going to let us out because you asked nicely. He pulled his arm free and hit the door one more time, and then he stopped because his knuckles were raw and the door had not moved, and he was a practical man who understood when an approach had failed. He stood with his forehead nearly touching the steel surface, breathing hard. I turned my light to the windows. The marine-grade plywood was bolted from the outside into reinforced frames. Nothing on the interior side suggested any quick exit. We were inside a structure built by someone who understood the difference between a house and a containment. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then from the center of the room, the shortwave radio on the scarred wooden table began to glow. The amber dial illuminated slowly, and the speaker produced a wash of static that filled the empty room with something that was almost texture. Leander turned. I turned. We both looked at it the way you look at a thing that has no business doing what it is doing. The static shifted, and a voice came through. It was a man's voice, unhurried, carrying the flat vowels of a Boston upbringing that 30 years of effort had only partially smoothed away. There was a quality to it I recognized without being able to name the quality of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in whatever room they occupied. Reginald warned me you two were persistent, the voice said. He told me Josephine raised a couple of smart kids. Smart kids should know better than to dig in graveyards. Leander stepped toward the table, fist still closed. Who is this? Let us out of here. A low sound came through the speaker that might have been a laugh. You found the box, Leander. You saw the birth certificate, the photographs, so you should already know who I am. A pause, precise and calibrated. I am the ghost your mother left behind. I stepped closer to the radio's mesh speaker. The frequency display read 14.225, a number that meant nothing to me at that moment, but that I understood instinctively had been set deliberately programmed into this machine long before tonight. This was not a piece of forgotten furniture. This was a communication point that someone had built into the room and maintained. "You are Percy," I said. "Got it in one." The amusement in the voice dropped away cleanly. "Percival Merritt. Though I go by Percy, and Merritt is a name I have complicated feelings about." Another pause. "Now, I did not drive 4 hours into the Maine woods for a family reunion. I am here for the ledger." Leander looked at me. I looked at him. We had found money passports, a birth certificate, an identification card. We had found a satchel and a photograph of a man our mother had circled in red. We had not found anything resembling a ledger. "We do not know what you are talking about," I said. "We found cash and documents. There is no ledger." The static thickened, and when Percy's voice returned, the measured quality was gone. "Do not lie to me." The words came out separated and deliberate. "Your mother was the chief accountant for the Winter Hill Syndicate from 1985 to 1989. Our father, Orville Merritt, ran the port operations. He moved cargo through Boston Harbor that the Port Authority never formally logged. Your quiet, strict essay grading mother managed the money. Every dollar that came in dirty and went out clean passed through her hands first." The room was very still. When the FBI started building their case in 1989, she panicked. She took $200,000 in cash and she took the master ledger. One book handwritten containing every offshore account, every shell transaction, every politician and law enforcement official in New England who had taken money from that organization. Names, amounts, dates, and she ran. The voice steadied. "She took you, Leander, and she left me with him." Leander had not moved since Percy began speaking. He was standing with his arms at his sides and his face arranged into a stillness that I recognized as something he had constructed deliberately because the alternative was something he could not afford in this room. The woman who had made him oatmeal every school morning and enforced lights out at 9 had laundered money for organized crime. The information did not fit inside the shape of what he knew, and he was holding it outside himself until he could find a place to put it. "We did not know any of this," he said. His voice was level. "I swear to God, Percy, we did not know." "I know you did not." A different quality entered the voice than something that was not softness, but was the absence of contempt. "That is the only reason I am talking to you instead of just waiting. Reginald sent us here," I said. "He gave us the keys. He told us this was what our mother wanted." "Of course he did." The bitterness was immediate and complete. Reginald Colborne was her fixer. He built the trust, managed the name change, kept her hidden for 3 decades. He has been a coward his entire adult life, and when Orville died in prison last year, I paid Reginald a visit and helped him understand the situation clearly. He used her will to send you up here to open the vault for me. I could not get through those doors on my own. But Reginald had the keys, and Reginald had you. The realization moved through me slowly, and then all at once. The yellow highlighted map. The professional patience with which Reginald had presented the addendum, the practiced grief, the watch glance. He had not been honoring our mother's dying wishes. He had been delivering us. "Pass the ledger through the mail slot in the back door," Percy said. "The cash you can keep. But if I do not have that book in 60 seconds, I'm going to pour 5 gallons of gasoline around the base of this structure and light a match." "We do not have it," Leander said. 50 seconds. I grabbed Leander's arm and pulled him toward the stairs. We went up fast, taking the steps 2 at a time, and came back into the bedroom where the open metal box sat on the iron cot, surrounded by scattered bundles of cash. Leander went at it immediately, pulling bills out and throwing them aside, checking between the stacks with systematic speed. "There is no book here, Scylla." He swept the last of the cash aside. "She did not leave a ledger in this box." The box was empty. I picked it up. The weight was wrong. I had noticed it when Leander first lifted it out of the floor cavity, the way he adjusted his grip, but I had attributed it to the metal and the cash combined. Now with the cash gone and the satchel gone, the box still felt heavier on one end than it should have. I turned it in my hands and looked at the interior. The inside was shallower than the outside by perhaps 3/4 of an inch. Enough to be meaningless on a quick look, impossible to ignore once you were paying attention. Give me the screwdriver, I said. Leander slapped it into my palm without questions. I jammed the flat tip into the seam at the interior base and struck the handle hard with the heel of my hand. The metal complained. I shifted the angle and struck again, and on the third blow, something released with a sharp pop and the false floor lifted free. Beneath it, sitting perfectly flat in a hidden space, was a black leather notebook. Small, the cover worn at the corners from handling. 30 seconds. Percy's voice came up from the radio downstairs. Then before he finished the sentence, I smelled it. Sharp petroleum rising through the floorboards from below. He was already pouring. Leander reached for the notebook. I pulled it back. Give it to him, he said. We slide it through and he lets us go. He will not. Scylla! Think about it. I kept my voice low and even. We know his name. We know what he is looking for. We know Reginald helped him. If he lets us walk out of here, we go directly to federal law enforcement with everything we just heard. He knows that. He is not stupid. Then what do we do? The smoke smell was growing. We burn. I was already looking at the wardrobe. But before I moved toward it, I turned back to the radio. The static was still running. Percy had delivered his ultimatum and gone silent, but the frequency display was still lit, the connection still open. He was listening. He wanted to hear us search and fail. He wanted to hear us panic. I walked to the table and leaned down close to the mesh speaker. Percy, I said. The static shifted. He was there. You said she spoke to you through the door. 6 weeks before she died. You told us she said if you took the ledger, everyone in that book would come for the girls. I paused. You remembered her exact words. After 25 years of believing she was dead, after 6 weeks of knowing she was alive, and living 20 minutes away after she closed that door on you. You still remembered her exact words. The silence on the radio was different from the silence before. She protected us, I said. Even then, even in that moment, she was thinking about Leander and me, not about you. And you know that. You have always known that. I straightened up. And you came here anyway, which means the man standing behind you in those trees has more leverage over you than your anger at her does. Which means some part of you is not here by choice. For a long moment, there was only static. Then Percy's voice came through, and for the first time, it sounded like something other than a performance. It sounded like a person. The people Orville owed when he died. They are not patient, and they know where I live. Then the ledger is the only thing protecting you from them, I said. If you give it to them, you become a loose end. If you give it to us, you become a federal witness. Another silence. 40 seconds, he said, but the certainty was gone from it. I know. I stepped back from the radio. I know. Leander was watching me. He had heard all of it, and he had understood it in the way that people who are built for structural problems understand load distribution and failure points. He understood that the conversation I had just had with the radio had not been for Percy's benefit alone. It had been for his. He needed to know that the man about to set fire to this house was not simply a monster. He was a person in a trap, and the trap had been built by a man now dead who had once been the father of both of them. Leander did not say anything. He just looked at me for a moment with an expression I had no word for, and then he looked at the wardrobe. Help me move it, I said. It stood against the back wall, solid oak, old and heavy built, in a style that matched nothing else in the room. The iron cot was functional. The nightstand was functional. The wardrobe served no function in a room that had never been used for sleeping, in a house that had never been used for living. My mother had not wasted anything in her life. She had not owned furniture she did not need. She had not kept a single personal photograph on a single wall. Every object in this house existed for a reason, and a wardrobe in a vault room had only one reason that made any sense. The scrape marks on the floor ran from the wardrobe toward the center of the room. We had read them as evidence of the wardrobe being moved to access the floor cavity beneath the cot. But a structural engineer standing in a sealed building with fire starting beneath his feet reads scrape marks differently than a person who is not worried. Help me move it, I said, going to the side of the wardrobe. We do not have time. Push. He came to the other side. We put our weight against it, and the wardrobe moved with the resistance of something that had been pushed many times before the floor beneath its feet worn smooth by repetition. It slid forward, and the wall behind it came into view. There was no wall. There was a steel-framed hatch, approximately 2 feet square, set flush into the drywall, and painted over in the same color as the surrounding surface so that it disappeared completely, unless you were standing directly in front of it. A flat iron latch, no lock. My mother had built an exit into this room and hidden it behind the one piece of furniture in the house that served no other purpose. But before Leander could reach for the latch, I saw something else. Taped to the inside face of the wardrobe's back panel with old medical tape gone brittle at the edges was a small piece of paper. I pulled it free and unfolded it under my flashlight beam. It was my mother's handwriting. Scylla, if you are reading this, you found the way out. The chute leads east past the foundation. The red cloth on the stone marks the exit from outside. Stay low, go right half a mile to the logging road. I am sorry I could not explain sooner. I loved you both more than you will ever know. M. Leander read it over my shoulder. He was quiet for one full second. Then he reached out and took the paper from my hands with a care that had nothing to do with the paper itself, folded it once, and put it inside his jacket against his chest. He looked at the hatch. Go, he said. From the radio downstairs, Percy's voice rose through the floor one final time. Time's up. A deep concussive sound rolled through the house, not an explosion, but a sudden ignition accelerant, catching at multiple points simultaneously, and then the roar of fire building fast in dry timber. The temperature in the room rose perceptibly within seconds. Through the floorboards, orange light flickered at the edges. Leander went into the hatch first, feet forward, and I heard him slide away into the dark. I looked back at the iron cot. $200,000 in old cash lay scattered across its surface, the currency straps from a bank dead for 30 years. I left it there. I pushed the notebook into the interior pocket of my jacket, went to the hatch, and went in. The chute was steep and narrow, the corrugated metal sides grabbing at my jacket as I descended. The darkness was complete for the first few seconds, and then a faint light appeared below the slope, curved sharply and leveled, and I hit the earthen floor of a horizontal tunnel, hard enough to jar my teeth. Leander was beside me on his feet, coughing. The tunnel was braced with heavy timber, the construction solid and clearly not improvised. It ran straight for perhaps 60 feet before terminating in an iron grate, and through the grate came the pale blue light of a night sky. We crawled toward it on hands and knees, and Leander hit the grate with both palms, and it swung outward on a hinge, and we tumbled out onto cold, damp earth at the base of a steep ravine thick with pine branches. Leander leaned against a hemlock trunk and put his hands on his knees. I pressed my back against the same tree and breathed. Then I remembered something. Wait, I said. He looked at me. In the tunnel, I felt something on the left wall, maybe 20 feet in. A box mounted to the timber. Metal, small. He looked back at the grate. We went back in. The smoke was threading down from above, now thin and acrid, and we moved quickly. 20 feet in on the left side, bolted to the support timber, was a flat metal container about the size of a hardcover book. Leander worked the latch. Inside was a small flashlight and a sealed envelope. On the front of the envelope, in our mother's handwriting, 3 letters FBI, and beneath them in smaller script, DM. Darlene Merritt. She had addressed the envelope using her real name. Whoever she had been when she wrote it, she had signed it as the person she actually was. Leander took the envelope and put it inside his jacket alongside the note from the wardrobe. We got out. We stayed at the base of the ravine for a long time. Through the trees, the cottage burned with the intensity of a building that had been prepared for burning. The flames reached the canopy of the nearest hemlocks before the roof structure failed, and when it went with a concussive crash that threw sparks in a wide arc over the surrounding forest. The stone foundation remained and the steel doorframe, and nothing else worth keeping. Percy stood at the edge of the tree line. He was perhaps 40 yards from where we were hidden, and the firelight was enough to see him clearly. He was lean with his hands in his jacket pockets and his face turned toward the fire. He stood the way people stand when they are watching something that has cost them something they cannot get back. Not triumphant, not relieved, something that had the quality of conclusion, but not of satisfaction. I watched him and I thought about what he had said on the radio, and I thought about a boy of 11 being told by his father that his mother had died in a car accident, and believing it and carrying it for more than 2 decades before a name in a newspaper began to pull the lie. Apart thread by thread. He was not a good man. What he had done to us tonight was not a small thing. But I could trace the line from where he had started to where he was standing now, and the line was not hard to follow, and I found that I could not look at him with a simple feeling. Then I noticed the second figure. It was standing in the shadow between 2 large spruce trees, perhaps 20 feet behind Percy, and to his right, perfectly still in the way that only a person who does not want to be seen is perfectly still. The figure was larger than Percy, broader through the shoulders, and it was facing not the fire but Percy himself, watching him, the way a supervisor watches an employee complete a task. Percy had told us he was there for the ledger. He had framed it as a personal matter, a debt, a reckoning. And perhaps part of it was. But part of it was also a figure in the shadows who had sent him to do the work and was now confirming the job was done. Percy was not the top of this. I put my hand on Leander's arm and pointed without speaking. He looked and went very still beside me. The roof caved completely, and the fire sent a column of sparks into the canopy. Percy watched it for a long moment. Then he turned and walked into the trees, and the second figure moved with him, and the darkness absorbed them both. We did not move for a long time after that. We sat in the cold with our backs against the hemlock trunk, and for a while neither of us said anything at all. The fire worked its way through the structure, methodically consuming the dry timber first, and then reaching for the contents of whatever remained on the upper floor. I thought about the money burning $200,000 in old bills returning to carbon and ash, and I felt nothing about that except a kind of rightness. That money had never belonged to anyone who deserved it. It had belonged to a machine that processed fear and violence into comfort for people who were already comfortable, and it was appropriate that it ended as heat and smoke in a forest in Maine. I thought about my mother building this house. Not a contractor she hired, but herself, her choices, her vision of what safety required. She would have found the land first, something remote enough that no one would stumble across it. She would have drawn plans, or at least thought through plans. She would have hired people who asked no questions and paid them in cash and not returned to the property for months afterward so that no pattern of visits could be traced. And before she hired anyone, before she ordered the steel door or the deadbolts or the filing cabinets, she would have stood in the clearing and thought, if someone gets inside, how do I get out? She had thought like that her entire adult life. She had thought like that while she made oatmeal and graded essays and attended school plays and watched Leander and me grow up in a Brooklyn row house on a quiet street where nothing alarming ever happened. The vigilance had never stopped. It had simply become the water she swam in. Leander shifted beside me. He was looking at his hands. The man in the photograph, he said, on the corkboard, the one she circled, that was Orville. Yes, I said. She circled her own husband. She circled the man who had become dangerous to her, I said. By the time she made that corkboard, she had spent years watching the news reports from a safe distance. She was documenting what she had left behind and what it had become. The circle was not about who he was to her. It was about what he had turned into. Leander was quiet again. Then she never told us about any of it. Not one word, not a hint. 22 years I lived in that house, and she never once gave me any reason to suspect that anything was wrong. She gave me a reason, I said. I just did not know how to read it. She was always watching for something. I saw it on her face in the kitchen that night when I was 9, and I filed it away as something that was too big for me to understand, and I was right that it was too big, and I was wrong to leave it there unfiled. Leander looked at me. You could not have done anything with it. You were 9. I know, I said. I know that. But it is a strange thing to look back at your entire childhood and realize that the fear was always there underneath everything, like a note too low to hear, but loud enough to feel in your chest. She was afraid every day, and she managed it so completely that we never knew. When the fire had settled to a low, sustained burn, and the first gray light was beginning in the east, Leander shifted beside me. He reached into his jacket and took out the folded note from the wardrobe, turned it in his hands once, and put it back. She built the exit before anything else, he said, before she put anything in that room. The hatch, the tunnel, the grate, the box in the wall, she built the way out first. The tunnel was not an addition. The timber bracing was the same age as the house itself, the iron hardware oxidized at the same rate as everything else in that structure. She had built the house around the escape route. The whole design had started with the question of how to get out. She knew this day was coming, I said. She just did not know when. Leander was quiet. Then she took me with her when she ran. I was 1 year old. She could have left me too. She did not. He looked at the smoldering ruin through the branches. What remained of the cottage glowed orange at the edges and black at the center, stone and steel, outlasting everything built between them. We walked out through the forest in the direction we had come from. I had counted the landmarks on the way in a habit so old I could not remember acquiring it, and I reversed them now in the dark. The logging road was 5 miles, mostly uneven ground, and we moved without speaking. We had been walking for perhaps 2 miles when we saw headlights. A patrol vehicle was parked on the shoulder of the dirt road with its lights off and its engine running, a white vehicle with the Oak Haven Sheriff's Department logo on the door. As we came close enough to be visible, the headlights came on. The driver's door opened. Deputy Leopold Calloway was a man of about 55, solid build, in a department jacket over a department shirt. He had the kind of face that accumulates credibility through exposure to weather and time. He looked at us, at the state of our clothing and our faces, and the professional assessment in his expression shifted into something more careful. "I was about to call a search and rescue," he said. "Saw a glow through the tree line an hour ago. You two come from Hemlock Road." "Yes," Leander said. I stopped Leander with a hand on his arm before he could say anything further. Calloway looked at me. "Deputy," I said, "in the last week or two, did anyone contact your department about property on Hemlock Road?" A man mid-30s, lean-built, dark hair, said he was dealing with a family estate. Something shifted behind Calloway's eyes. He took a careful breath. 2 weeks ago, he came by the office in person, said he was a nephew of the previous owner trying to assess the property for probate purposes. Asked whether there had been any recent activity up there. I told him I would keep an eye out. He paused. "How do you know about that?" "Because that man just locked us inside of that property and burned it down." The silence between us lasted about 3 seconds. "He used your report tonight," I continued, "when you came to check and called it in, that told him we were inside and that you had confirmed it." Calloway's jaw tightened. He was a man who had been used as an instrument without his knowledge, and the recognition of it was moving across his face in real time. "My radio call was on an open channel," he said. "I know." He looked at Leander, then back at me, and I watched him work through the arithmetic of the evening and arrive at the number he did not want to reach. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Call the FBI field office in Augusta," I said. "Only the FBI. Tell them 2 witnesses with material evidence in an organized crime investigation are coming in. Do not let anyone near Hemlock Road until federal agents secure it. Not state police, not county, not anyone from your department." I held his look. The man up there tonight did not come alone. The person who sent him is still out there. Calloway reached for his radio without any further discussion, which told me what I needed to know about him. He was not part of it. He had simply been handed a piece of information by a confident stranger and done his job with it, and now he was doing his job with different information. We got in the back of his vehicle. Through the rear window, I watched the dark tree line recede as Calloway turned the car south. The sky in the east was going from black to charcoal to the particular shade of gray that comes just before the day commits to itself. Leander sat beside me with his elbows on his knees. He had the envelope from the tunnel and the note from the wardrobe inside his jacket. I had the black notebook in mine. Between us, we were carrying 35 years of a woman's survival, the record of everything she had done and hidden and built to protect the children she had chosen to keep. And somewhere behind us, 2 figures had walked into a forest carrying the knowledge that the ledger had not burned with the house, which meant they were not finished, which meant neither were we. I put my hand in my coat pocket and found Vivian Calloway's number still there on its folded slip of paper. I held it in the dark and thought about what she had said on the sidewalk in Boston. "Call me before you call the police." The before part had seemed strange at the time. It no longer did. The FBI field office in Augusta opened at 8 in the morning on a normal day. We arrived at 6:45 and the lights were already on. The FBI field office in Augusta occupied the 2nd floor of a federal building on Western Avenue, and the woman who met us in the lobby had clearly not been sleeping. Agent Odette Fairfield was 48 years old or thereabouts, with gray coming in at her temples and the kind of economy of movement that develops in people who have spent decades making quick assessments of rooms and situations. She was already in her jacket when we came through the door, already holding a paper cup of coffee. She was not drinking, and when she saw us, the expression on her face was not the expression of someone encountering an unanticipated situation. It was the expression of someone watching a sequence of events arrive at the point they had long expected it to reach. She shook our hands. She looked at our clothing, at the smoke smell that had followed us in from the cold, at the particular quality of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from the kind of night that rewires something in the nervous system. She said, "Come upstairs," and led us to a conference room with a table and 4 chairs and a window, looking out over a parking lot going pale in the early light. Calloway had called ahead. She knew the broad shape of what had happened. But before either Leander or I could begin, she said something that stopped us both. "I know why you are here," she said, "and I know what you found. But before you tell me anything, I need to tell you something first." Leander pulled out the chair across from her and sat down with the deliberateness of a man conserving energy. "All right." Fairfield set her coffee on the table and folded her hands. "I was 22 years old when I joined the Bureau. My first significant assignment was in 1991, working on a task force investigating financial networks connected to organized crime in New England. We had been building a case for 2 years against an operation centered on Boston Harbor. We had identified the key players. We had traced the money through 4 layers of shell accounts. What we did not have was a single witness willing to testify and a single document that could be authenticated in court." She paused. "In the fall of 1991, a woman contacted the task force through an intermediary. She had worked inside the organization. She had kept records. She was willing to negotiate terms." The room was very quiet. "Her name at that point was Darlene Merritt," Fairfield said. "She came to us with a partial document set and a list of demands that were not unreasonable given her situation. She wanted full identity protection, relocation assistance, and a guarantee that her children would not appear in any public record connected to the investigation." Fairfield looked at me, then at Leander. "Her children, plural. She had a son named Leander and a daughter named Priscilla, and she was not willing to proceed under any terms that put either of you at risk." Leander's hands resting on the table were very still. "What happened?" I said. "It was not quite a question." "The negotiation broke down," Fairfield said. "Not because of bad faith on her part. Because Orville Merritt, through channels we still do not fully understand, learned that someone inside his operation had made contact with federal authorities. He did not know who, but the field of candidates was narrow. Darlene understood that if she completed the arrangement and testified, the trial would eventually become public record, and public record meant her name, and her name meant Orville would find her and find the two of you." Fairfield picked up her coffee and put it down again without drinking. "She pulled back. She disappeared. She built a life under a new identity and stayed inside it for 30 years. "And you knew," Leander said. "We knew where she was from 1994 onward, yes." The word "yes" landed in the room with a particular weight. "You knew she was living under a false identity in Brooklyn," Leander said, and his voice had taken on the careful flatness that in my experience meant he was managing something large. "You knew she had the ledger, and you left her there." "We respected her decision," Fairfield said. "That is not the same thing." "No," Fairfield said, "it is not." The honesty of the admission seemed to take Leander slightly off balance. He had been prepared for a defense and received an acknowledgement instead, and it left him with nowhere to direct the force he had assembled. He looked at the table for a moment. I said, "She thought if she came back to you, you would use her, force her to testify, and testifying meant exposure." "That was her assessment," Fairfield said. "She communicated it through Reginald Colborne in 2019. He passed along the message that she was still alive, still in possession of the original documents, and that she had no intention of coming forward while Orville Merritt was living." Fairfield met my eyes. "Orville died in federal custody 14 months ago. 3 weeks after his death, I reached out to Reginald to reopen contact. Reginald informed me that Darlene, by then going by Josephine Langford, had died of a cerebral aneurysm 6 days prior. The timing of it settled over me like something physical. "She died before you could ask her," I said. "Yes, and then her will send us up to that house." "Reginald contacted me after the reading," Fairfield said. "He told me he had sent you to Oak Haven. He did not tell me about Percival Merritt. He did not tell me he had already been approached by Percy and had provided him with information about the property." She stopped. "I learned about Percy's involvement when Calloway called this morning." Leander looked up. "So Reginald played both sides." "Reginald Colborne had spent 30 years being careful about which side he was on at any given moment," Fairfield said. "He told me enough to keep me manageable and told Percy enough to keep himself safe. He was trying to be in a position to survive whatever outcome occurred." She paused. "He was not successful at it." Where is he now? I asked. In custody. Boston field office picked him up at his home at 5:15 this morning. Something shifted behind Fairfield's expression. He did not resist. He asked to make a phone call, and then he sat down and waited. I thought about the man in the mahogany office, his professional grief, the yellow highlighted map, the two watch glances during a 15-minute meeting. My mother had known what Reginald was. She had used him anyway because he was the instrument available to her, and she had left me the warning in pencil on the back of a note because she understood that instruments of that kind could be turned in any direction by sufficient pressure. Leander reached inside his jacket and placed the sealed envelope on the table between us. The letters FBI were visible in our mother's handwriting, and beneath them the two initials of her real name. He placed it carefully, the way you place something that has been carried a long way. We found this in a container mounted to the tunnel wall, he said. She built it into the escape route. Fairfield looked at the envelope without touching it. Something moved across her face that she did not try to suppress. She prepared this before she died, I said. She built the escape route. She put the container in the wall. She labeled the envelope with the name she had spent 30 years not using. I reached into my jacket and put the black notebook on the table beside it. Then I reached into my other pocket and placed the micro SD card in its small plastic case beside the notebook. 3 separate items, stored in 3 separate locations in that house. Anyone who found one would not necessarily find the others. Fairfield looked at the 3 objects. The notebook is the ledger. The notebook is the ledger, I confirmed. And the card? I found it inside a bundle of cash in the metal box. She hid it there separately from everything else. Fairfield reached under the table and produced a laptop she had brought to the room before we arrived. She had been expecting something close to this. She took the card from its case and inserted it into the reader. The files loaded. They were audio recordings, dozens of them organized by date going back to 2001. Fairfield opened the earliest file and the room filled with my mother's voice, and for a moment the 3 of us simply sat with it. The voice was younger than I remembered, or perhaps it only sounded younger because it was unguarded, because there was no child in the next room and no colleague in the adjacent classroom, and no one at all to hear it except the device she was speaking into. She spoke the way people speak when they are finally alone with the truth. Scylla started 1st grade today. She asked me why I do not have any pictures from when I was little. I told her I lost everything in a fire. I did not know how to tell her the real answer, which is that the person in those pictures is someone I am not allowed to be anymore. And explaining that would require explaining everything else, and explaining everything else would require her to carry something that no 6-year-old should carry. A pause, and then her voice dropped slightly. She looked at me with those eyes she has, the ones that say she knows there is more to the answer than the answer I gave. She has always known when I was withholding. I do not know where she gets it. Leander made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He covered his mouth with one hand and looked at the ceiling, and after a moment he put his hand down and his eyes were wet, and he did not bother doing anything about that. Fairfield closed the file. She looked at both of us. There are 46 additional recordings. I know, I said. She nodded slowly. I will need to review all of them as part of the investigation, but I want you to understand that they will remain under protective seal except for specific content relevant to the case. What your mother said about her children in those recordings is not evidence. It belongs to you. I had not expected that, and the unexpectedness of it undid something that had been held together since the night before. I kept my face arranged and breathed through it, and after a moment I said, "Thank you." Fairfield opened the leather notebook. She turned the first few pages with the care of someone who understands they are holding a thing that has been waiting a very long time to be read. The handwriting inside was my mother's, smaller than her usual script, dense with numbers and names and dates. Fairfield's eyes moved over them with increasing focus. She turned 3 pages and stopped at a list of names with dollar amounts beside them. She looked at the list for a long time. "How current is this?" Leander asked. "Some of these people are dead," Fairfield said. "Some are retired, and some of them—" She turned the notebook so we could see the page without reading the specific names or not. The morning light through the conference room window had gone from gray to white. Outside in the parking lot, 2 additional vehicles had arrived, MO agents moving toward the building with the purposeful stride of people whose morning plans had just changed. "Percival Merritt," I said. "Where is he?" "We do not have him yet," Fairfield said. "We have a description and a vehicle partial from what Calloway observed at the scene. We also have the identity of his associate, a man with a prior federal conviction for extortion who was released 18 months ago. Both are currently being sought. She looked at me steadily. The person behind Percy, the individual he was reporting to, that is a more complex matter. But the ledger gives us a foundation we have not had before. He told us he was being pressured, I said, that Orville's death created a debt situation and someone was using it to leverage him into recovering the ledger. That is consistent with what we know about the post-incarceration reorganization of the network, Fairfield said. She paused. I want to be direct with you. Percy Merritt committed serious federal crimes last night. He confined you against your will, threatened your lives, and destroyed a property. None of that is mitigated by the circumstances of his history. She closed the notebook. But the circumstances of his history will be part of the legal picture. I cannot make you a promise about outcome. I can tell you it will be considered. Leander looked at his hands. He is our brother, he said. The words sat in the air between all three of us, with the particular strangeness of a true thing that has never been said aloud before. Yes, Fairfield said simply. Leander was quiet for a moment. Then what happens to him? That depends on a number of factors, Fairfield said. His cooperation, the extent of his prior record, the degree to which he was acting under duress, which is what you described, and what the evidence of the second individual in those woods supports. She was choosing her words carefully. People who come in and help us understand the structure of what we are dealing with tend to fare better than people who make us work for it. He knows who the second person was, I said. We believe so, yes. Leander looked up. You should know something. He told us on the radio that our mother spoke to him through the door 6 weeks before she died. She warned him that if he took the ledger, everyone in that book would come after Leander and me. She said that to him, the man she had not seen in 25 years, the son she had left behind. And her first instinct was still to protect us. He stopped. I want that to be part of whatever picture gets built of who she was. Fairfield looked at him steadily. It will be, she said. They held each other's gaze for a moment, and something was transacted between them that went beyond the case and the evidence in the federal proceedings. Leander had needed to say it. Fairfield had needed to hear it. And now it was on record in a way that mattered. The agents from the parking lot were now in the building, and through the glass wall of the conference room I could see movement in the corridor. Fairfield excused herself for 10 minutes and came back with a younger agent who took our formal statements in careful sequence. The process took over an hour, and by the time it concluded, the sun was fully up and the parking lot outside was half full. During a break, I stepped into the corridor and found a quiet corner near the water fountain and called the number Vivian Calloway had given me. She answered on the second ring. It is Priscilla Langford, I said, a breath on the other end. I have been awake since 3, she said. He is being looked for. The FBI has the ledger and the supporting documents. Reginald Colborne is in custody. A silence, then very quietly, good. Vivian, I said, how much did you know? The pause that followed was long enough to be its own kind of answer. I knew your mother was afraid of something that had followed her for a long time. I knew the man who came to her door was not a relative. And I knew that when she did not come out for 2 days afterward, it was not grief or illness. Another pause. Your mother never told me the specifics, but she told me enough once near the end that if anything happened to her and her children went to Oakhaven, I should try to give them what I could before Reginald Colborne shaped their understanding of the situation. She told you to find us. She told me to try, Vivian said. She said you might not trust me. She said Leander especially might not. A sound that might have been a small laugh. She knew her children. I stood in the corridor of the federal building and thought about my mother sitting across a fence from this woman over 11 years of Brooklyn mornings, saying enough and not too much, constructing a final layer of protection from the materials available to her. She would be proud of you, Vivian said. Both of you. She said more than once that if anyone could figure it out, it would be you. I thanked her and ended the call and stood there for a moment before going back into the conference room. Percival Merritt was arrested at Logan Airport in Boston at 11:40 that morning. He was at the gate for a flight to Vancouver when the 2 agents approached him from either side with the quiet efficiency of people who have done this many times. He did not run. He did not argue. According to the agent who called Fairfield with the update, he sat down when asked, put his wrist forward, and looked at the floor. His associate was taken in the airport parking structure 20 minutes later, having waited in a rental car for a flight that Percy was never going to board. Fairfield told us this in the conference room and watched our faces as she did. Leander received the information with a no. I received it with a feeling I did not have a clean word for something that occupied the same space as relief, but was not made of the same material. Later that afternoon, Fairfield arranged for a federal victim services coordinator to speak with us about the process going forward. During the session, I found myself thinking not about the legal proceedings, but about the photograph we had found in the metal box. My mother, young and smiling, holding a child I had never known existed, standing beside a man whose face she had circled in red 30 years later in a house she had built to survive. She had smiled in that photograph. A real smile, the kind that cannot be performed. Whatever she had been at that moment, whoever she had been before she became the woman who checked the locks twice every night and kept her past sealed in a cottage in the Maine woods, she had been capable of that smile. It had been in her all along. It had not been lost. It had been locked away with everything else, and the locking away of it had been a cost she had chosen to pay because the alternative was a cost she was not willing to make her children pay instead. At 4 in the afternoon, Reginald Colborne's attorney contacted the federal prosecutor with a request. Reginald wanted to speak with me before any formal proceedings, not with his attorney present, not on record, just a brief conversation, a request he understood he had no right to make and no leverage to enforce, and that I was entirely free to decline. I did not decline. They put us in a small room with a table and 2 chairs and a federal marshal standing outside the door. Reginald came in without his jacket, which was the first time I had seen him without it, and the absence of it made him look older and smaller. He sat down across from me and folded his hands on the table, and for a moment said nothing. Then she forgave me. Before she died, I do not know if she told you that. She did not. I went to see her last spring. I told her I had been contacted by Percy and that I did not know what to do. She sat across from me in her kitchen, and she listened to everything I said, and when I finished, she was quiet for a while, and then she said, "Reginald, I forgave you for this 20 years ago. I have just been waiting for you to do something worth the forgiveness." He stopped. "I did not do something worth it. I sent you up there to open that house, and I told myself it was honoring her wishes. It was not. I was protecting myself." I looked at him, the wire-rimmed glasses, the papery quality of his hands. A man who had spent 3 decades managing the consequences of choices made in fear and calling it loyalty. "I know," I said. "I am not asking you to forgive me," he said quickly. "I am asking you to know that she did, because I think it matters for your understanding of who she was. She was not a person who withheld things out of hardness. She withheld them out of protection. Even forgiveness she withheld until she thought it would do some good." I sat with that for a moment. "The 9 words on the back of the note," I said. "She wrote them in pencil, barely visible. She knew you would handle the note before we got it." He looked at me. "Yes, she warned us about you, and she forgave you, and she used you as a delivery mechanism all in the same document." Reginald Colborne looked at the table. "Yes," he said again. "That was Josephine." I stood up, and the marshal outside opened the door, and I walked out of the room and down the corridor, and found Leander waiting at the end of it. He looked at my face and read whatever was there. "Okay," he said. "Yes," I said, "let us go." He fell into step beside me. We walked the length of the corridor without speaking, and when we reached the elevator, I pressed the button, and we stood side by side waiting for it. "What did he say?" Leander asked. "That she forgave him 20 years ago." I paused. "That she was waiting for him to do something worth the forgiveness." Leander was quiet for a moment. "Did she get it?" "No," I said, "she did not." The elevator arrived, and we stepped in, and for the ride down, neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say about Reginald Colborne that the facts had not already said. He had been a man of modest courage and large fears, and he had made the choices that men like that make, and the consequences of those choices were now moving through the federal system, at the pace federal systems move, which is slow and thorough, and largely indifferent to what any of the people involved think about it. What my mother had made of him over 30 years was a tool that had also been a kind of safeguard. She had maintained the relationship not because she trusted him, but because she understood that a man who knows too much about you and is slightly afraid of you will work harder to keep you safe than any more principled arrangement. She had managed that relationship the same way she had managed everything else in her life, with patience and precision and a clear understanding of the difference between what people said they would do and what they would actually do when the pressure came. We were in Augusta for 2 more days while the formal statements were processed and Fairfield's team worked through the initial assessment of the ledger. On the second morning, Fairfield called us back into the conference room and told us that preliminary review had confirmed the notebook contained actionable intelligence on 11 individuals currently holding public office in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, along with documentation of offshore accounts that federal financial investigators had been attempting to trace for 15 years. She delivered it with the measured tone of a professional, but underneath it, I could hear something that had been waiting a long time to sound like what it sounded like now. She also told us the micro SD card contained, in addition to the audio recordings, a series of encrypted files her technical team was still working through. She could not tell us yet what they contained. She said she would keep us informed. Before we left Augusta, Fairfield walked us out to the parking lot herself, which I noted. It was not something the situation required. She could have sent the victim services coordinator or the younger agent who had taken our statements. She chose to do it herself. At the car, she shook our hands again, the same grip as the first meeting, and she looked at both of us for a moment with an expression that was professional and also something more than professional. "Your mother made one contact with us in 1991, she said, and then she went silent for 30 years. In 30 years, a lot of people did not go to prison who should have. A lot of money stayed in the wrong places. A lot of names in that notebook went on to build careers that the rest of us had to live inside of." She stopped. "I am not putting that on her. She made the choice she had to make to keep her children safe, and I would not have her make a different one. But I want you to know that what she left in that house, what you brought here, it matters. It matters in ways that will take years to fully understand." She walked back inside. Leander and I sat in the car for a moment before starting it. "Years," he said. "Yes. She has been dead for 6 weeks." "I know." He started the car. On the last morning before we drove back to Boston, Leander and I sat in the parking lot of a diner on Water Street and drank coffee from paper cups and looked at the Kennebec River moving through its October light. The trees on the far bank had gone to orange and yellow, and the current was steady and dark and did not seem in any hurry. Leander had our mother's note in his hand, the full note front and back, and he was reading it the way he had been reading it at intervals since we found it in the wardrobe. Not as though he expected the words to change, but as though he was still in the process of learning them by heart. "She wrote the pencil part, knowing I might not see it," he said. "She wrote it for you, not for me." "You were 1 year old when she ran," I said. "She knew you did not have the questions she could not answer. You were too young, she knew I did." He nodded slowly. "She knew you would look at the back. She taught me to read carefully." He folded the note and put it in his inside pocket. He held his coffee cup in both hands and looked at the river for a while. Then, "What do we do with the money if any of it survived the fire?" "It did not," I said. "The structure was complete by the time the foundation was cool." The investigative team confirmed it. $200,000 of 1990s mob cash is ash. "Good," he said, and I could hear in the word that he meant it entirely. 2 weeks later, on a gray Wednesday morning in Brooklyn, Leander and I sat in the kitchen of the row house on Cumberland Street and went through our mother's things. Not the furniture, not the practical items, but the small accumulations of a life. A drawer of rubber bands and expired coupons. A shelf of novels with margin notes in her handwriting corrections and underlinings, and small stars beside sentences she found true. A cardboard box in the back of the bedroom closet containing 3 items. A birthday card I had made her in 2nd grade from construction paper, and too much glue, a photograph of Leander's college graduation that she had kept in a frame until the frame broke and then kept without the frame, and a single piece of paper torn from a legal pad folded twice. We sat at the kitchen table and went through the box together the way you go through things when you are not sure what you are looking for, picking each item up and setting it down, not deciding what to do with anything yet. Leander held the graduation photograph for a long time. It was taken outside the engineering building, and he was wearing his gown and holding his diploma and grinning in the slightly stiff way that people grin when a camera has been pointed at them for the 5th time in an hour. Our mother was standing beside him with her hand on his arm. She was not smiling for the camera. She was looking at him at his face with an expression that was private and complete. in the way that the most important expressions are the kind that belong only to the person feeling them and are never meant to be photographed. Leander looked at it for a long time and then set it down on the table face up. She was happy, he said. Right there, that was real. I looked at the photograph. He was right. I unfolded the list. The list contained 2 columns. On the left, in no particular order, were things she had not been able to give us. Stability without lies. A history we could speak aloud. Grandparents. A photograph of herself as a child. Her real name. The brother we had never known existed. 35 years of mornings without fear. I read the left column twice and felt the weight of each item. They were not small absences. They were the kind of gaps that shape a childhood in ways the child does not understand until they are standing in a kitchen at 30 years old holding a piece of paper their mother never sent. Each item on that list represented a decision she had made, a cost she had paid a morning. She had gotten up and kept going anyway. On the right side of the list, in the same pencil, were things she had given us instead. The row house paid for, the education paid for, the English language as a tool of precision and power, the habit of reading carefully, the knowledge that a person can survive the consequences of their own worst choices if they are willing to keep moving. And at the very bottom of the right column, underlined once in slightly heavier pencil, as though it had been written last, and pressed harder than the rest 2 children who knew how to find the way out. Leander read it over my shoulder. He was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the Brooklyn morning was doing what Brooklyn mornings do, indifferent and alive, the street noise rising and falling in its familiar patterns. The kitchen smelled the way it had always smelled, coffee and the faint ghost of old wood, and the light came in through the east window at the angle it always came in at this time of year. She kept the list, Leander said finally. She kept both lists, I said. He straightened up and went to put the kettle on, which was what he did when he had finished feeling something and was ready to do the next thing, and I sat at the kitchen table with the paper in my hands and read it one more time from the beginning. My mother had been a woman of locked doors. She had kept her past in a box under a false floor in a house in the Maine woods, and she had kept her love in a kitchen drawer in Brooklyn folded twice and written in pencil and not addressed to anyone because she had never found the moment to give it. She had waited for the right time to explain, and the right time had not come before she died. So she had done the next best thing, which was to leave us a map and trust that we were the children she had raised us to be. The kettle began to heat on the stove. Leander stood at the window with his back to me watching the street. In Augusta, a federal prosecutor was working through the names in a black leather notebook. In Boston, a man in wire-rimmed glasses was waiting to learn what his choices had cost him. Somewhere in the federal system, a man who had been told his mother was dead when he was 11 years old was being processed into a situation that was not simple and would not be resolved quickly, and whatever came of it would take years and would require things from all of us that we had not yet been asked to give. None of that was finished. Most of it was just beginning. And beginning, I had learned, was something my mother understood better than most. She had begun again from nothing more than once, and she had done it without a map and without anyone to tell her it was possible. She had done it because the alternative was worse, and she had kept going until it was not. But the morning was here and the kettle was heating, and Leander turned from the window and said, "You want anything in it?" meaning the coffee, and I said yes, and we sat together in our mother's kitchen, in the ordinary light of an ordinary Wednesday, and that for now was enough.